a covenant remembered. Number 2.
Search for Saul's relative.
Search for Saul's relative. Number 3.
The reception of Mephebosheth.
All right, number 3, the reception of Mephibosheth.
Ziba assigned responsibility.
Number 4, Zeba assigned responsibilities.
Mephibosheth moves to Jerusalem.
Mephibosheth moves to Jerusalem. Very, very good. A good outline. We'll just leave it with his outline today. How about that? Okay? Don't always have to have my outline. And that's a good outline. All right, let's get through the chapter and let's talk about it. A very interesting chapter. And the reality is this chapter is really all about us. Did you know that? It's really all about us. We think it's all about who? Mephibosheth. No, it's all about us. Okay, when you really get down and you really look at what's going on. Of which house did David inquire? Yes, Saul's house. And David said, is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul? Who is David? Yes, king of who? King of Israel. Who was king before him? Saul. Now think about that. Here David is, as the king, asking a question about any survivors in the person who was king before me. Is that a good sign? No, not normally. You know, normally why is the question asked? Yes, in order to get rid of the previous administration and all that were associated with it, because they posed a threat to the nation, didn't they? They could be working behind the scenes trying to get in power. And would David be especially weary of that? Why? Why do you say that? He'd be especially weary of it. Okay? Saul was out to kill him. But what else had happened? Had David just had the kingdom as his for the full 40 years? No. Guys, for 7.5 years, part of that kingdom belonged to who? Yes, Ishbosheth, who was of the house of who? Saul. Okay, so here David is. He's established the kingdom well. He's got the Ark of the Covenant in with the tabernacle. He's abolished his enemies. And now he asks this question, right? Is there any yet left of the house of Saul? Oh, nope, nobody. What did he want to do for those of his house? Yes. See, we didn't finish the whole statement, did we? He says this, is there any yet that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Man. Guys, do you get a little insight into the heart of David? You get a little insight, don't you? Folks, David's not a man who harbors bitterness in his heart. He'd been opposed just brutally by Saul and by Abner and Ishbosheth after that. And yet, here he is now, still has a good heart toward the house of Saul, and especially toward whom? Toward Jonathan. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Saul would have used a statement like that maliciously, wouldn't he? Just to get them out in the public and then do something evil. You're right. It shows the difference in the hearts of those two individuals. Did anybody look up the word kindness and what it means? Nobody? Strong says that it means this, kindness. Boy, I learned a lot right there. Brown Driver and Briggs says it means this, kindness. Man, I'm learning so much from these scholars, aren't I? Brown Driver and Briggs also says that it means goodness. It's translated by other words in the King James Version. It is translated favor, good deed, merciful kindness, and mercy. So it's translated in a lot of different ways, even though it's just defined as kindness. So I want to show somebody good. I want to show this individual mercy. I want to bestow upon this individual some very good deeds. I wrote this thought down. This is a king, a man of great authority who desires to show a blessing to another. Got that? Let me ask you something. When any of our presidents, regardless of who it is, does something good for a person, is that event highlighted in our society? Most of the time it is. Because he makes certain it's highlighted. Okay? Doesn't he? There's a pretty big show because you see, a man in great authority, he has the ability to bless anybody he wants. But most of the time, individuals who are blessed by a king or by anyone in a prominent position are few and far between. It's a big deal because he doesn't want to be accused of abusing his power, okay, and just, displaying kindness on just anybody and everybody, although that sometimes happens. Notice that he says that I may show him kindness for whose sake? Jonathan's sake. Let me read you 1 Samuel 20, 14 and 15. This is Jonathan. And thou shalt not only while yet I live show me the kindness of the Lord that I die not, but also thou shalt not cut off any of thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one from the face of the earth. This was an occasion when Jonathan and David were together and they were making a covenant with one another. And Jonathan tells him, you will not cut off your kindness from me while I'm living, nor yet when any of your enemies are dead. And now David is doing what? He's honoring his covenant. See, there's another aspect of David, isn't it? Would it have been easy for David just to have said, Jonathan's dead, I know I made a lot of promises, but he's gone, he'll never know. He could have done that, couldn't he? And yet here he is, remembering I made a covenant with a man, and I need to honor my covenant. I need to do what I said. I need to follow through with my promises. Folks, David is a good man. Perfect man? No. But a good man. Wouldn't you like to have known David? I would. I would have loved to have known him. What was the name of Saul's servant who was called unto David? Zeba. How would you like that? I've never run into a Zeba. Anybody? I've run into a lot. At the who? At the zoo. Oh, man. If y'all want to see Zeba, go to the zoo. And there was of the house of Saul a servant whose name was Ziba. How did Ziba answer David when asked his name? Thy servant is he. Listen to this. And when they had called him unto David, the king said unto them, Art thou Ziba? And he said, Thy servant is he. Folks, I want you to listen to what he said, okay? He's telling David, I am what? Your servant. Okay. Now, yes, he was of the house of Saul, wasn't he? But yet, he says, David, I am your servant. Got it? Don't forget that. Very important to remember that point. His answer was an admission of humility, wasn't it? And it was also an admission that he was subservient to the king. Whatever you need, I'm here to accomplish the task. I, or thy servant, is he. What question did David pose to Ziba? Yes. And the king said, Is there not yet any of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God unto him? Now the previous time, he had inquired about and said, I want to show unto them kindness for whose sake? Jonathan's sake. Now do you hear what he says? I want to show unto this individual the kindness of who? I want to show unto this individual the kindness of God. Folks, sometimes that's a different kindness than what we might display on an individual, mightn't it? Does God have a tendency to show a little bit more kindness upon us than we do upon others? Oh, yes. You know? And David doesn't just want to show kindness. I want to show extreme kindness. I want to show abundant kindness. I want to show the kindness of God unto this individual. David wants to abundantly bless this individual. Clark notes that the kindness of God involves the highest degrees of kindness that one could express. Anybody in here ever had another person bestow upon them the kindness of God? And when it happened to you, that's the way you thought about it? Now, if you go back and you start thinking, you might say, well, yeah, this event was like that. But let me ask you this. How many times have we attempted to truly manifest the kindness of God to another person? That's a pretty big deal. It's one thing to be kind to you, but it's another thing to be kind the way God is kind. True or false? There was no one left of Saul's house. False. And Ziba said unto the king, Jonathan yet hath a son. I just asked myself this question. Can you imagine how David felt when he heard, number one, that there was a person of Saul's house living? And not only was there a person of his house living, whose son was he? Jonathan's. Wow. Are you talking providence, folks? Right? I want to show kindness. I want to show kindness for Jonathan's sake. Is there somebody to show it to? Yes. Who is he? He's the son of who? Jonathan. Just happens. Just happened to be. Wow. But there was just one little problem, wasn't there? What was wrong with Mephibosheth? Which is lame on his feet. Do we remember when that happened? When did it happen? Yes, when Saul and Jonathan were killed in battle, the last chapter of 1 Samuel, and the nurse learned of that, she immediately grabbed up Mephibosheth, didn't she? And they were escaping out of the city, and somehow, we don't know whether he was dropped, or whether he just fell himself, but somehow he fell and became lame in both feet. Don't know what happened, do we? How old was he? He was 5 years old. Okay, 5 years old when it happened. We then had the first 7.5 years of David. That would make him what? 12.5, right? But here's what's interesting. What we'll find out is that he had a what? He had a son. So what we're talking about, he's got to be around 20 years old, 25 years old at this time. Are we well into David's reign? Yes, folks. See, sometimes we forget time factors. How long did David reign? 40 years. Okay, so we got 7.5 years, right? But then we've got another maybe 10 more years into David's reign before this actually happens. So we have all of these things happening during that time. David conquering his enemies, the bringing in of the ark. There's really a lot of time that is passing, and we just read it from chapter to chapter to chapter. Okay, but there's quite a bit of time that is passed. I wrote this note down. He was of the house of Saul, and he was lame. There was not much by way of commendation of this man to David, was there? I want to bless a person in the house of my enemy, and the one I want to bless is a lame man. Oh yeah, that's who you put blessings on, right? That's not who you normally bless, folks. Is it? Most people who get blessed by the king are what? Allies, warriors, people who've done great things. This man's done nothing. Nothing. He's been living in the house of another individual for years and years and years after his father had died and his kingdom had been turned over to David. There is nothing to commend this man to David whatsoever. He has nothing to offer David. And yet David wants to what? David wants to bless him. In whose house was Mephibosheth living? Micah. And Ziba said unto the king, Behold, he is in the house of Micah, the son of Amiel. One made this note. There's a possibility, watch this, that Micah was the brother of Bathsheba. Wow. Micah was the brother of Bathsheba. I just wrote down 1 Chronicles 3, verse 5. I don't know if that's the case or not. That possibility to me seems remote, does it you? Because if he was living in Bathsheba's brother's house, don't you think David would have known that? See, David didn't even know this man existed. So I don't know that that's the case. Somebody brought that up. I said, boy, that just doesn't sound right to me. Where was he from? Lo-Debar. Okay, Lo-Debar. And folks, Lo-Debar was located on the east side of the Jordan River. Okay. Where is David located? Right now, Jerusalem. You had to cross the river Jordan and go into the Transjordan River up to the north in order to find Lo-Debar. So he was quite a ways from the city of Jerusalem. I just wrote this. The son had been living in somewhat obscurity, far from the presence of the new king. Now, I've given you 3 descriptions of Mephibosheth, have I not? The house of an enemy. A man lame on his feet. A man who lived far from the presence of the king. You got that? You don't think this will preach? This right here will preach, folks. This is preaching material. Okay? If you don't get where I'm going right now, something wrong with your head. I'm just kidding about that, but there may be something wrong with your head. True or false? David sent and fetched Mephibosheth out of Micah's house. True. Don't you love the way the King James reads there? Then King David sent and fetched him. See, I love that. That's just good old southern stuff. You just go fetch him. You know, where did you go fetch him? See? You just thought that the King James was just old-timey book. Okay? No, it's pretty up-to-date, pretty southern. For me, I got it. Now, I wrote this question down. No, I knew exactly what, yeah. Mike said I didn't even have to look that word up. He's right. Got that one. I wonder how Mephibosheth is feeling right now. Okay? He's going to send and fetch for Mephibosheth, right? You know, Mephibosheth gets the word, hey, the king wants to see you. Man. You know, a while ago, Jim made mention of the fact of what Saul would do. Saul would make some kind of request like this, expose the man, and then do what? Do him harm. You think that might have been in the mind of Mephibosheth? Man, there's just no telling. Okay, just no telling. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come to David, he blank on his blank and did blank. He fell on his face and did reverence. He fell on his face and did reverence. Mephibosheth came with respect for David as the new king, did he not? I find it interesting that this is the first time we read of Mephibosheth's name in the text. Isn't that true? Is there one of the house of Saul? Yes, there is. A son of Jonathan, located in Lo-Debar. He's never named up until right now when he finally appears in the presence of David. Could be. Could have been very difficult for him. That little word, reverence, means to depress, to show homage to royalty, to bow down to a superior in homage. When David addressed Mephibosheth, how did he respond? And David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, Behold, here it is, thy servant. Who else had said that? Ziba had. Both of them acknowledged that we are your servants. Is that pretty smart when you're standing before the king? Yeah, you know. I'm no servant of yours. Okay, off with his head. Here's something that's interesting, and I looked at the word is the same in both contexts. Behold thy what? Servant. Anybody look the word up? Nobody? Watch this. It means bondsman or slave. Behold thy slave. Behold, one that is subject fully and completely to your will, King. It's pretty interesting. It's a pretty strong word. And it's the same word that describes us as Christians in the New Testament. We are God's what? Servants. We are His slaves. We are His bondmen. Okay? We've been purchased, haven't we? We've been purchased with a price. And we are slaves of Christ. David told Mephibosheth that he should or should not fear. Should not. David said unto him, Fear not. Folks, it's an awesome thing to stand in the presence of one who is your superior, is it not? It's a fearful thing to appear before someone who could be your enemy. It's a fearful thing to appear before someone who could easily take your life. Couldn't he? David could have done with Mephibosheth anything he wanted to do. And Mephibosheth knew that. And David speaks the words, what? Fear not. Here's a man in authority, a man who's a monarch, who is seeking to do all he can do to calm the fear of this servant who's before him. I love the picture. What was David going to show Mephibosheth? Kindness. Here it is again, 3 times. 3 times we've read this. For I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake. I wonder if Mephibosheth said this, thank God for Dad. You know? Could Jonathan have taken another path when it came to David? Sure he could. Sure he could. He could have taken the same path that his father had taken, couldn't he? But for some reason, Jonathan sees through everything that Saul couldn't see through, and he sees the real man, David, doesn't he? He brings this man in as a friend, and we're not talking about just an acquaintance. We're talking about a close friend, aren't we? 3 times, Jonathan and David made covenants with one another in the course of their friendship. Okay? And now David is still paying this back. Here's something that's interesting. Go study this sometime, okay? During the course of David's life, David did very little for Jonathan. Okay? during the course of Jonathan's life, David did very little for Jonathan. Okay? Jonathan was always the one doing something for David, almost every time. Protecting his life, going to his father to be an intercession, going out to him in the wilderness to encourage him. I mean, it was just constant. Jonathan was giving and giving and giving and giving. Now Jonathan's dead. Jonathan never received the benefits of the friendship. Until what? Until now, when David has the ability to show his friendship to Jonathan through his son Mephibosheth. Pretty interesting, isn't it? You know, sometimes in a friendship, you're not the getter all the time. Sometimes in a friendship, you're the what? You're the giver. Okay? But eventually, it comes back. Okay? What two things did David say he would give to Jonathan? Number one, all the land of Saul thy father. And number two, you, Mephibosheth, will eat bread at my table continually. Now, we read that and we go, I thought he was going to show him some kindness. And he's just going to give him his land back. And he's going to let him eat at his table every day. Whoop-de-doo. Are those two big deals? Yeah. Folks, that land of Saul's had been taken by David when he became king. It was now part of what? Royal territory. And it meant that the inheritance through Mephibosheth would not continue through his lineage. But now David what? Now David restores that land to Mephibosheth. Does Mephibosheth have a son? Yes. Isn't it interesting that they specifically mention he has a son? Guess what's going to happen? Mephibosheth is going to die and his son is going to what? Now be given an inheritance. He now has a legacy to pass on. If this hadn't happened, Mephibosheth would have died and Saul's lineage would have ended right there. Isn't that something? He restores the lineage of Saul through Mephibosheth. Pretty big deal, folks. Oh yes, it could have possibly been quite a big lot of land that was given to him. Big enough to farm, and it's going to take quite a few farmers to do it, isn't it? But what's the second one? He would eat bread at David's table continually. Is that a big deal? I wrote down 4 things. If you're sitting there at the king's table, who's around at the king's table with him, do you think? All of his top advisors, right? Who else? Family, okay? All of his major advisors probably are sitting there. Pretty big group of individuals, right? And now here you are, this lone little dude out here, right? Mephibosheth, come rolling in on a wheelchair, right? Park yourself at the king's table. Can you imagine the first meal? Look at that poor dude. Folks, you begin to understand relationships, don't you? Who the king likes, who he doesn't like, who he struggles with, who he doesn't struggle with, who he favors. Because you're listening, you're hearing things. Feelings would be shared, wouldn't you? You know when somebody's angry and upset with one person or another. That happens at tables sometimes, doesn't it, during discussions? Personal information would be shared. Not only about the king and his family, but his advisors and things that are going on in the nation. Even, fourthly, some national concerns might be brought up at that table. Folks, you're a pretty important person if the king allows you to sit at his table. Did you know that? Pretty important person. Emily?
Do you think, where was he living? Was he living in the
Don't know. I thought that same question. Emily asked, where was he living? I don't know. Was he living in the king's palace? Very well may have. Had a special room set up for him. He may have had a house next door built for him, just for himself, out on his property somewhere, and somebody went and transported him every day. I don't know. The Bible doesn't really say where he was making his abode. But I thought the same thing. I sure did. Listen to this. Ye are they which have continued with me in my temptations. And I appoint unto you a kingdom, as my Father hath appointed unto me, that ye may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. Does anybody know who said that? Jesus of His followers. Folks, you and I have been made privileged to sit at the table of the King. It's pretty good, isn't it? We are as good as Mephibosheth, and guess what? We are just as lame as he was. Aren't we? Oh, maybe not physically lame. We can walk, right? But we were lame. We were in sin. We were in iniquity. Were we enemies of God? Yes. And were we residing far from Him? Yes. And yet He allows us to what? Sit at His table. Folks, don't tell me this chapter doesn't talk to me. We are all just what? Blessed Mephibosheths, aren't we? That's who we are. We're in the same position as Mephibosheth was. When Mephibosheth heard David's words, what questions did he ask? Yes, and he bowed himself and said, what is thy servant, that thou shouldest look upon a dead dog as I am? Folks, in Israel, they didn't have pet dogs. Okay? Now I know that hurts your feelings. Okay? And they didn't feed them ribeye. And they didn't dress them in Macy's designer clothes for dogs. And they did not take them to the vet for every little burp that the dog had. Dogs were unclean in Israel. They were scavengers. They roamed the streets. They scavenged for food. They often lay dead in the streets. They were of no count to people in the cities. They were looked upon with disdain and contempt. Remember the rich man and Lazarus? He was sitting at the gate of the rich man, and the dogs came. Where'd they come from? From the streets. And did what? Licked his sores. And so now he says, what? Who am I that you would bestow such a blessing upon this, who am just a what? Just an old dead dog. Useless, worthless. Man. I wonder, is that the way we view ourselves when we view ourselves prior to our conversion? And now God's allowed us to come and sit at His table. We were just dead dogs. Oh no, I deserve salvation. He should have saved me anyway. Folks, we were all just what? A bunch of dead dogs that God saved. It's hard to look on ourselves that way, isn't it? But that's the way Mephibosheth said. To whom did David speak these words? I have given unto thy master's son all that pertained to Saul and to all his house. Zeba, yes, Zeba. Now, folks, it's right now that the words that I told you to remember before that Ziba had spoken to David are important. What did he tell David? I am thy servant. Uh-oh. What was Ziba and his sons and his servants to do for Mephibosheth? Yes. They were to till the land and bring in the fruit of the land. Wow. They now became what? Farmers. I don't have a clue what Ziba and his sons and his servants were doing before now, but I know exactly what they got to do now. New occupation. You see, this didn't just affect who? Mephibosheth. Now, Ziba's whole family is impacted by this. Hey, Ziba, come here. Just gave Mephibosheth this ton of land, and guess what? You, your sons, your servants, you got to till it and farm it for him. Bring in the increase. Are you kidding me? I said I was a servant, but, I don't know about this. That'd be rough, wouldn't it? Yes.
Some have said that Ziba had to be a very wealthy person to bring Mephebosheth in and care for him all those years.
Well, see, Ziba hadn't done that. That was Micah. He had lived in Micah's house. And so, yeah, I believe Micah was a pretty well-off individual for certain. Ziba was just a servant of who? Of Saul. We don't know what Ziba was really doing. He just knew that Mephibosheth was living and where he lived, didn't he? And now his whole life is going to be changed. The Bible says in 1 Samuel 9:10 he had 15 sons and 20 servants. 35 people plus Ziba, 36 people are now going to be employed on Mephibosheth's behalf. Another commentator made this statement. Most likely, Ziba and his family and his servants received half of what was produced through that farm. I don't know where he gets that, okay? But it very well may have been that was what was part of the deal. I don't know. I've not read that in Scripture. But where would Mephibosheth always eat? Yes, he would always eat at David's table. 4 times, folks. Now, 3 times the kindness of David is mentioned. 4 times it's said in this text that Mephibosheth is going to sit at my table continually. Folks, it's got to be important. It's got to be a big deal. Now, Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. True or false? Ziba refused to do as the king ordered. False. Then said Ziba to the king, according to all that my lord the king hath commanded his servants, so shall thy servant do. Mephibosheth would eat bread as one of the king's sons. There it is again. You just can't get enough of it. Here's the thing that impresses me. What was the name of Mephibosheth's son? Micah. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. I thought he was what? I thought he was lame. He wasn't too lame. He wasn't lame enough that he couldn't get married. He wasn't lame enough that he couldn't have a son. But he was lame, wasn't he, in his feet. Okay? All that dwelt in the house of Ziba were blank unto Mephibosheth. Servants, yes. In what city did Mephibosheth dwell? Jerusalem. For he did blank blank. He continually at the blank's table and was blank on both his feet. See, I'm impressed at how many times we're told he was lame, how many times we're told he ate at the king's table. Now, folks, I put down this. In this chapter, we have a picture of God's grace manifested toward us. God is like David. He desired to show kindness. God has a close relationship with Jesus Christ. He searched us out to bless us. He elevated us to positions of sons in His house. We are like unto Mephibosheth. We have been in opposition to God. We too are lame in our sins. Who are we that God should look upon such dead dogs as we are? There is nothing within us to be desired. We lived far from God. God blesses us on behalf of Jesus' sake. We are able to feast at the Lord's table continually. We've been elevated to positions as sons of God. Folks, this chapter is a beautiful chapter upon who we are and the relationship we have with our Lord Jesus Christ. Good